Okay, here we're going to cover the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which are part of the diencephalon region. And we're also going to talk about the basal nuclei, which is what you call a subcortical structure of the cerebrum. Both the diencephalon structures and the basal nuclei are hard to visualize because they're deep structures of the brain. From the sagittal section of the brain, you can localize the thalamus as an oval structure in between the brainstem and the corpus callosum. Right above the thalamus, it's a structure called the epithalamus, which will include the pineal gland. Anterior and inferior to the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which usually appears as a triangular region with the infundibulum jutting out anteriorly, which would lead to the pituitary gland, not shown here. And the basal nuclei is lateral to these, completely covered as it is deep within the cerebrum. So it's useful to look at a 3D visualization of all the structures. The thalamus is a paired structure with the right and left halves flanking the third ventricle, just superior to the midbrain. The hypothalamus, again inferior and anterior to the thalamus, and here you can see the infundibulum and the pituitary gland attached. The basal nuclei, which has several components to it, sits lateral surrounding the thalamus and the lateral ventricles, removed here. The caudate nucleus follows the shape of those lateral ventricles. So we're going to first go over the diencephalic structures here. And these two structures have no obvious similarities function-wise. While the hypothalamus is a major player in visceral motor output, the thalamus is more involved in somatic sensory information. So sitting in between the brainstem and the cerebrum, the thalamus is ideally located for its function of filtering incoming information. The vast majority of sensory information from all over the body, including the special senses, will pass through the thalamus first before going up to the cerebrum. Axons carrying sensory information through these ascending tracts bound for higher regions first synapse with neurons in the thalamus. As an example, visual information coming from the optic nerve enters a specific subregion of the thalamus and then is routed up toward the correct visual processing center of the cerebral cortex. And all these different sensory modalities are going through the thalamus and then routed up to a particular region of the brain devoted to processing that particular information. So that's why the thalamus is sometimes referred to as a relay center, directing sensory information to the right areas. But that's a vast oversimplification. Remember that when there is a synapse in a pathway, there is an opportunity to modulate that signal. And in fact, your CNS is bombarded with information picked up by sensory neurons, only a small portion of which you are aware of at any given moment. So those thalamic nuclei are organized in such a way so that they could amplify or tone down the signals headed for the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus therefore plays an important role of what you are conscious of and paying attention to at any given moment. So in thinking of the sensory pathway, you can include the thalamus in the pathway, and next lecture we'll talk about those sensory cortices that receive that information. Moving on to the inferior portion of the diencephalon and to the hypothalamus, which, despite its small size, has a huge role in your brain and behavior. The hypothalamus can be considered a center that is responsible for regulating those motivated behaviors, sometimes referred to as the 4 F's: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproductive behavior. So that's way beyond the scope of this class, so we're going to focus on two major aspects of hypothalamic functions. One, the hypothalamus can be considered the master regulator of the autonomic nervous system. That is the visceral motor system that controls your viscera, and so the hypothalamus is regulating heart rate, blood pressure, the activity of the digestive tract, secretion from sweat glands and salivary glands. All of these, you may notice, can be physical manifestations of your so-called emotions. The second function to note is the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system, because the hypothalamus is controlling the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is a major endocrine gland, which we won't discuss here, but we'll get back to the hypothalamus when we talk about the emotional center of the brain, the limbic system. And the next part of the brain is part of the deep gray matter of the cerebrum that cooperates with higher order motor centers involved in the control and execution of movement. This is the basal nuclei, and it's difficult to do justice here concerning the actual functions of the basal nuclei, but one way to get a glimpse of what it does do is look at what happens when it is no longer functioning correctly. Parkinson's disease is characterized by slow and jerky movements, tremor of the face, limbs, or hands, muscle rigidity, and a great difficulty in initiating voluntary movements. This condition stems from degeneration of dopamine cells of the substantia nigra in the midbrain, which normally modulate the basal nuclei. Without that dopamine input, the basal nuclei is no longer functioning correctly, and these symptoms are the result. I had mentioned previously that the cerebellum was also involved in the control of movement. Again, the easiest way to think of the differences of these two brain regions, which both are involved in the control of movement, is cerebellar dysfunction causes a person to appear drunk, while at least some basal nuclei dysfunction takes on the appearance of Parkinson's patients. So that's it for that subcortical structure. Next, we're going to be moving on to the cortical structures. See you later.